Longtime listeners of this podcast know how George Washington, in his role as the first president of the United States, established many precedents that have carried on from one presidency to the next up to the present day. For this episode, I'm joined by a special guest to examine arguably the most impactful institution in the executive branch that Washington established not by law, but by practice during his presidency. Lindsay Chervinsky is a historian at the White House Historical Association. She received her BA in History and Political Science from the George Washington University, completed her master's and PhD from the University of California, Davis, and was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Her writing has been featured in Law and History Review, the Journal of the Early Republic, Presidential Studies Quarterly, Time, and the Washington Post. She is an expert in the cabinet, presidential history, political culture, and U.S. government institutions. Lindsay's first book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, was just published by the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press and is a fascinating read. Lindsay and I had a great conversation that brought back to mind and expanded upon various points that we covered in our journey through the Washington presidency. Without further ado, let's turn to my discussion with Lindsay. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. Before we got started, I actually wanted to share that I was in the audience of a panel at Scheer in 2017 that you participated in, and you were talking about Jefferson's cabinet. And I remember you mentioning at the time that you were working on this book, which became The Cabinet. And so it's a great honor to finally have had a chance to read it and to have an opportunity to talk to you about it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Wow, that was a long time ago, and feels like a million worlds ago. But yes, it is. It does a good job of highlighting how long scholarship actually takes.
Absolutely, and it's an amazing work. And I've actually listened to a few other interviews that you participated in preparation for this, and to hear how it evolved from your dissertation into this actual work. And it sounds like you were really intentional in trying to make sure that this was approachable for a more general audience. And so I know, and I think you mentioned that you had rewritten it 3 times in the process. So
yeah, I always say I don't advise doing that if you can help it. But like you said, I had a really clear vision of what I wanted it to be. And I felt like I owed the story of the cabinet because it really hadn't been told. I owed it to myself and to the story to get it out there to as many people as possible. And so I felt like the writing really needed to tell a story and to be a narrative. And that just took me a little while to figure out how to do because it was my first time doing it.
Well, and just speaking for myself, and I'm sure many others agree, we thank you for taking that time and really crafting this into a great work. To kind of start and thinking of this idea of the cabinet, because one of the things you talked about were kind of the influences that helped Washington to get to this idea of the cabinet. And you mentioned both his experience in the Continental Army and some of how he approached his staff in the Army, but you also brought up the idea of the British cabinet. And so I was wondering if you would mind speaking to how that British cabinet format influenced the creation of the American cabinet, both in using it as a model of what the cabinet should be and what it cautioned Washington and his successors against.
Yeah, so I sort of think of the British cabinet as almost like an anti-origin. So the British cabinet evolved from the Privy Council, and the Privy Council was basically too big to be an efficient advisory body for the king. And so he started pulling off some of his favorite advisors into this other group, which eventually became known as the cabinet. And that was really what the Americans, what their concept of a cabinet was going into the revolution. And this was a body they really viewed with suspicion because they tended to meet privately. There was very little record of what was happening, of who was saying what, of who was, kind of in charge, of who was taking responsibility. And they really blamed that group for instigating a lot of the conflict that led to the revolution. And so that was something that they were deeply suspicious of. And when the Constitutional Convention occurred and the delegates were trying to craft a new government, they were very intentional about trying to make sure there wasn't a body like that was built into the system. So they did not want a private advisory body that would be a cabal or like filled with the president's cronies and have a lot of corruption. They wanted there to be transparency and responsibility at the highest levels of government. And so they rejected proposals for councils that actually looked almost identical to the one that actually evolved once Washington was in office. And Washington and the secretaries were very aware of these expectations. Washington was, of course, the president of the Constitutional Convention. He was there every day. He attended every session. He drank tea and socialized and went to the theater and listened to music and had dinner with the delegates every day after the sessions. So he had a very clear sense of what was expected of them. And so one of my greatest frustrations with the evidence is that they never actually wrote down that they were trying to avoid comparisons to the British cabinet. I wish that they had. But you can kind of tell through their actions that they're trying to avoid comparisons by demonstrating their virtue, by demonstrating their republicanism, and this is little r republicanism, by trying to demonstrate their responsibility in office and that the president is in charge and they're not trying to steal extra authority. All these little things that they're really trying to cultivate an image. And so in that way, you can kind of tell by reading their actions and the way that they dress and the way that they talk, that they were always had in the back of their minds this idea of the British cabinet that they wanted to avoid.
And I like that, and thank you for bringing up the Constitutional Convention and kind of the various ideas that they had, but then ultimately rejected about the cabinet system. And that kind of gets to one of the points that you made in the book. Even after the Constitutional Convention and the government under the Constitution starts, Washington actually experimented with various types of advisory bodies other than what we now know of as the cabinet model. Would you mind taking a moment to talk about those alternatives that he tried, but that he ultimately rejected?
Yeah, that's right. So Washington was very attentive to really trying to stick to the letter of the law in the Constitution when he first came into office. And so there were two options that were available to him that were detailed out in Article 2, Section 2. The first is that they really expected the Senate to serve as a council of foreign affairs. And that seems really crazy to us in the 21st century because the Senate is 100 people and, right now kind of either serves either as a veto or a rubber stamp on treaties and appointments. But back then, the Senate was only 24 people when it first gathered because Rhode Island hadn't yet ratified the Constitution. So 24 is not an impossibly huge number, and it was in theory possible that they could give advice. And they were indirectly elected by the state. So they were considered to be sort of safe advisors because they could be recalled if they basically gave really bad advice. So Washington initially did try and meet with the Senate for advice on a treaty and a foreign policy issue, and it went very badly. And the Senate wanted to refer the issue to a committee, just like a legislative body usually would. And Washington was really frustrated because he felt like that was not how diplomacy worked. He needed immediate answers and immediate guidance. So after that one visit, he never went back. So that was sort of a rough start to the Constitution and to the Senate and the president's relationship. The other option was written correspondence that the president could exchange with the department secretaries about issues pertaining to matters in their department. And Washington initially really did this with the secretaries. He would ask them for advice or, exchange letters about something that came across their desk. But written correspondence, especially back then, took a really long time because you were dealing with parchment and quill, and it had to dry, and then you had to have it delivered, and then you had to wait for the response. And these are really complex issues that they were dealing with. So that process of constantly writing back and forth with follow-up questions or more details just really wasn't efficient enough. And so Washington started leaning towards individual consultations. He also explored a couple of different options based on some other models that they were probably familiar with based either on Great Britain or sort of just their general understanding of history. So the first was sort of like an unofficial prime minister situation. James Madison was very close to George Washington. He had helped him with a number of issues as they were leading into the presidency. He had been instrumental in getting Washington to attend the Constitutional Convention. And so when he was in the House of Representatives, he sort of served as this unofficial prime minister, helping Washington with his first address to Congress, helping Congress write the response, helping Washington write the response to Congress's response. and making sure that if an issue came before Congress, that Washington's sort of ideas were subtly included under the table. And so that worked for the first year or so, but then Madison started to split with the administration on some financial issues, especially legislation that Hamilton had brought forth. And as the relationship started to sour a little bit, Washington no longer really turned to Madison for advice as frequently. And then the last option was actually the Supreme Court. And John Jay was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he and Washington were very close, and Washington frequently asked him for advice on foreign policy or legal issues or even like social etiquette questions about how the president should comport himself. And Jay was more than happy to provide that sort of advice. But in 1793, when there was a real question of neutrality and how the United States should go about enforcing neutrality, which is a legal question, Washington asked the Supreme Court for their sort of collective guidance. And the justices basically turned down that request, and they said it would be inappropriate until they were reviewing a piece of legislation. So that was the last option that Washington sort of considered and was rejected by the Supreme Court.
And that actually brings up one of the individuals that I really wanted to talk to you about, because one of the points that you make in your book is that there are, it seems like when folks write of Washington's cabinet and Washington's administration, there tends to be so much focus on Hamilton and Jefferson, but you also have these other figures that modern day students of history may not be quite as familiar with, but that were key members either officially or unofficially of the cabinet. And so you had mentioned John Jay. Could you speak a little more to kind of his role in Washington's presidency?
Yeah, so John Jay was had served as the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the Confederation Congress. And there's some debate about whether or not Washington asked him to stay on in that position, because Washington really respected his advice and respected his expertise. But whether it was sort of Jay's preference or an unspoken preference, Jay ended up being appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But they got along well. They sort of thought about things the same way. They both had respect for each other's sort of very intense moral compass. And so from the very beginning, Washington was asking Jay for advice, especially because Thomas Jefferson, who ended up being the Secretary of State, didn't actually take office until early in 1790. So Washington had about 3/4 of a year in office where he really leaned on Jay to continue to provide guidance in that area, as well as things like, how he should interact with citizens on the street and whether or not he could host parties or attend gatherings or go to the theater, things like that, where he just kind of wanted people's opinions that he respected. And so Jay continued to provide sort of this unofficial guidance throughout Washington's presidency, including to the other secretaries and the members of the cabinet when they would, have a question. Sometimes they would take it to Jay either before they talked to Washington, or they would talk to Washington and then they would take it to Jay to see what he had to say and get his perspective.
And another individual that you mentioned that Washington had a long-standing relationship, even prior to his becoming president, and that played a critical role in his presidency was Henry Knox. Would you mind speaking a little to him? I know in the example that you were talking about when Washington tried to consult with the Senate in person, Knox was the one that was kind of by his side for that painful experience for the president.
Yeah. I think Knox and Randolph are the two sort of underappreciated figures in the 1790s. Maybe Jay too, but Knox and Washington first met in 1775 when Washington traveled up to Boston to take over the Continental Army. And they sort of immediately hit it off. Washington immediately trusted Knox. It didn't hurt that he led the famous mission to Fort Ticonderoga to bring back the cannons for the siege of Boston, and so sort of immediately had this military success and acclaim. And he went on to serve as the Major General of Artillery. He was with Washington every step of the way during the war. At the end of the war, Washington rewarded him by giving him the command of West Point. And then Knox went on to serve as the Secretary of War for the Confederation Congress. And during that time, during his tenure in that position, he oversaw relationships with Native American nations. He tried to reform the militia. He oversaw sort of domestic threats to the nation, including Shays' Rebellion. And so he had unbelievable firsthand experience on top of this already great relationship with Washington. And so he was kind of a no-brainer to stay on in the Secretary of War position. And especially in the early years of the administration was absolutely essential because Washington was very preoccupied with trying to get relationships with Native Americans on a peaceful footing. And so that fell under the purview of the Secretary of War. So Knox and Washington were working hand in hand. And we can see how important Knox was to Washington during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, when Knox actually leaves because he has to go back to Maine to sort of deal with his crumbling personal finances. And Washington is really upset that he left. And when he doesn't come back quickly, is very distraught that he's not there and misses his advice and wants his counsel. And so that's not something that Washington reveals all that often. He's not particularly, loquacious about missing someone, but he does say that to Knox. And so that indicates to me that he was a very, very important part of the cabinet. And he frequently, I think, gets overlooked because he so often agreed with Hamilton. And so people like Jefferson sort of discounted him as just, going along with Hamilton's whims. But actually, Knox had this incredible military career and if Hamilton, came to believe that a strong military and a strong national government was important because of his military experience, then Knox had way more reason to believe those things as well. And so he really came to his opinions through his own life experiences.
Absolutely. And when I was working on the Washington series for the podcast, Knox was definitely one of those figures that, you read in so many sources. It is basically the Hamilton or the Jefferson narrative that he was just kind of Hamilton's lackey. But whenever you start digging in a little more, you see, no, he really did have his own opinions. And like you said, he came to them of his own volition. It wasn't just because Hamilton said so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also I think one thing, it's really hard to quantify this because this is sort of speculation on my part, but Knox was a very warm person by all accounts. And some of the people that Washington surrounded himself, like Hamilton and Jefferson, weren't particularly warm towards Washington. It was much more of like a business relationship. And so I think that personal friendship, that warmth was probably really essential.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that you really speak to is how that the various roles that the cabinet played, not just in terms of managing the departments, but in making policy, but then also in the social aspect of surrounding people and thinking of the cabinet as kind of a form of family.
Yeah, absolutely. They were, Washington referred to them as his official family, and they certainly were. They provided support. They were there during social events. He invited them to the theater and to go out riding with him and to go to see gardens. And so he wanted them around and he selected them for a reason.
So many people ask me how I felt when George Floyd was killed. And as I sit across a table from a black man who's about to talk about how the murder of another black man felt, I don't think it really matters how I feel.
Hello, I'm Stephen Dorsey, host of Black and White from Evergreen Podcasts. We'll explore and explain how white advantage, bias, and outright discrimination continues to plague our society. Black and White is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, and I think one point that you get to about another role that the cabinet played was in this gauging of public opinion. You mention in the book the methods that politicians in the early republic used to gauge public opinion. And you said that, quote, Washington experienced a more complicated relationship with public opinion than many other public officials. So I was wondering if you would mind talking about some of the methods that Washington and his cabinet members and other politicians of the time used to get a sense of public opinion, and what made these methods effective for the Washington presidency and in the early republic in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So public opinion was pretty hard to gauge back then because we didn't have polling and there wasn't, cable news and there wasn't online options and there certainly wasn't Twitter. But there were a couple of different methods that politicians or people sort of in the public eye could use. So the first was their own personal networks through which they would send letters and exchange correspondence and other sort of newspaper clippings. And letter writing back then was not always as secret as we would think of private correspondence today. often you would, if you had your friend's blessing, you would take their letter and you would show it to other people. You would allow other people to read it. Maybe they would write like a note on the outside of it and then forward it along. And so these networks were really intended to channel information both down to sort of your local communities, but then also from your local communities back to the seat of government. And they were very intentional. And so all of the first members of the cabinet, including Washington, kind of cultivated their own networks through their official communications and their official connections, but then also through their family and friends. So that was probably the most important way. But then there were also a series of publications which had sort of varying degrees of seriousness. And one of the first people I think to write about this super effectively was Joanne Freeman. And she showed how there were these different types of publications, starting with like the least serious to sort of just the anonymous piece in a local newspaper. And people understood that if you didn't put your name to it, it wasn't really all that important. And maybe if you did a broadside with your name on it, but it's sort of like, a big piece of paper that was tacked to a tree, maybe that was a little bit more important, but it was intended to be sort of a quick transitory message and it wasn't going to last all that long. A more serious publication like a bound pamphlet was definitely taken seriously, but was expected to only reach sort of the elite or the rich, the people that could actually pay for that sort of pamphlet. And then the most broadly accessible and the most serious was a signed letter in the newspaper. So if you put your name to it and you staked your reputation on it, it was a very serious message indeed. And so these are basically different ways that elites could communicate with the public, but then also receive communications back by looking at what was being said and what sort of op-eds were being written and what sort of messages were being conveyed in these various types of publications. And newspapers at the time in the 1790s, they were really proliferating. And so not only were there more of them, but they were being printed more frequently. And they would often take messages from newspapers in other locations and reprint them. And so in that way, we can track news from, like South Carolina all the way up to Boston to see how fast it was expanding and, what sort of messages were traveling and at what rate.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for bringing that up, because that was one of the points that was really fascinating to me when you went through kind of the breakdown of the various types of sources and what that can tell us about how the information was perceived and how serious or not it was taken by individuals of the time.
Well, and I should also say, just for clarification, when elites were concerned about public opinion, they were primarily concerned about what white men thought. So it is an important distinction that sometimes women did write in newspapers anonymously, or even publish books, like Mercy Otis Warren published books, but by and large, white men were the audience that they were targeting.
Absolutely. And I think that's one point that you really help the reader to understand in the cabinet is the audience and the sources that are existing are the lack of sources that we have that sometimes shape or reshape or misconstrue kind of how we perceive of the time period and what was going on. And I think you do make that point very clear about why there is so much of a focus on Hamilton and Jefferson, because we've got these volumes of letters to and from them that we're drawing from. And so their voices seem to grow ever larger just because we've got more sources and more readily available sources. But it's important to note that there were other figures, both in official circles, but then in the larger context of the United States whose voices we may not be hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, one of the great gifts about their very copious documents and, letters that they preserved is that we can actually get at a lot of different topics through their letters. So, of course, like incredible scholars like Annette Gordon-Reed have brought to life the Hemings family through the Jefferson letters. And so that is a great opportunity that is, when people don't necessarily leave a written record themselves because either they were illiterate or, history did not prioritize what they were saying, we can still sometimes get at their lives through people like Jefferson and Hamilton. But then we also risk allowing them to dictate, what history remembers. So as you noted, Knox tends to get a bad rap because of how Jefferson described him. And in some ways, I think that that's true for Randolph as well. And it's because, Jefferson kind of had the last word on the subject.
And speaking of Randolph, he was one of the figures that I wanted to ask if you would mind expanding on a little bit, because whenever I was covering the Washington presidency for the podcast, like you said, he does get this bad rep and is sometimes undervalued in studies of Washington's presidency. But again, like with Knox, whenever you start digging down, you see just how critical of a role he played and how close, especially once he became the second Secretary of State, the critical role that he played in the cabinet.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was essential and very central. So I think he gets a bad rap for two reasons. The first is that Jefferson sometimes wrote that decisions in the cabinet would be decided 2.5 to 1.5, alluding to alluding to Randolph's sort of wishy-washiness, which I think it's hilarious line and it's really very funny. But I think Randolph really saw himself as a nonpartisan, unbiased figure. And so he really tried to approach every decision from that perspective. And sometimes that meant he sided with Knox and Hamilton, and sometimes that meant he sided with Jefferson. And Jefferson found that infuriating because he really always expected to have Randolph's support. The second reason is that he sort of resigned in very dire, dark circumstances, and that has led a lot of people to sort of discredit him. In 1795, there were a series of letters that the French minister had written back home to the French government, and through a series of strange machinations, a British ship acquired them and gave them to the British minister, and the British minister gave them to Timothy Pickering and Oliver Wolcott. And I think that they were sort of driven by partisan impulses because Randolph was a little bit more Republican leaning and had such significant sway with Washington in a way that they did not. I think they were sort of out to get him. And so they translated these letters in very dubious French and basically concluded that he had offered to sell state secrets to the French for a bribe. And I should be very clear that I don't actually believe that that is what happened. I think he said in 1794, when referring to the Whiskey Rebellion, that for a few $1,000s, the French could sway the course of events, referring to if the French invested in the rebels in Western Pennsylvania. So unfortunately, Washington didn't have very good French either and really depended on Pickering and Wolcott's translation. And it's a really sad moment because the way that he confronts Randolph really offended Randolph because they had been close friends for so long. Randolph had served as Washington's aide-de-camp early in the Revolution, and then throughout his entire tenure as the Attorney General of Virginia and the Governor of Virginia had served as Washington's private lawyer, so they were very close. And as you said, once he was Secretary of State, he was really Washington's preferred advisor. He had one-on-ones with Washington when the other secretaries were excluded. He was trusted with far more information. And he had a really brilliant legal mind, so the other secretaries also consulted him, especially on legal issues. So he felt very hurt when Washington kind of kept these allegations from him and then confronted him in front of the other secretaries, didn't really treat him with honor. And so it was just a very sad end to the relationship. And I think it's one of those moments where, from a presidential perspective, you kind of understand why Washington acted the way he did to protect his administration from any hint of scandal. But at the same time, from a personal perspective, he kind of seems like a jerk. And I think that's important to show. And so Randolph ends up resigning and going back to Virginia, and he serves as an attorney for the rest of his life. But he's kind of, as a result, forgotten in the history books.
And I really appreciated that when you were writing about his resignation, one of the things that you noted was that this should be understood within the context of the 1790s honor culture. And, that was one thing that really struck me as I was going through the Washington presidency, is this idea of honor and place and the importance of maintaining a good name. And I think that is very important to keep in mind as to understanding why Randolph reacted like he did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to overemphasize how important a man's reputation was at the time. It was his political and social currency. It was the thing that would permit you to have business deals and credit and transactions. It allowed you entry into higher social circles. And so without that reputation, you really had nothing. And Randolph, while he came from a wealthy family, he actually wasn't that wealthy himself. And so he really worried about any, hint of scandal on his reputation, what that might mean. And so he ended up kind of acting a little bit rashly and publishing his correspondence with Washington in a way to try and defend against, rumors and insinuations. And there was nothing that would break a bond with Washington faster than publishing correspondence.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because that becomes kind of a theme that runs through various points of the Washington presidency. For example, during your examination of the Genet affair, you mentioned how Hamilton had urged Washington to put Genet's correspondence before Congress as it would damage Jefferson and his supporters politically. And then you've got this instance of yet again, the revelation of diplomatic correspondence that's used kind of for political gain against Randolph. And I was thinking, as I was reading this, the XYZ affair, later on in the Adams presidency came to mind. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you might speak to what this might tell us about the political power of diplomatic correspondence in the early republic.
That's a great question. In some ways, I think it is a fun thing to see because it shows that in some ways politics really hasn't changed that much at all because we still have scandals surrounding, leaked correspondence. And so it's always helpful to remember that while a lot of things have changed, some things very much remain the same. But I think that what these episodes reveal to us is that the 1790s were a decade that were filled with moments of stress and anxiety. The country was constantly on the brink of war with France or Great Britain or both or Spain. And so diplomacy and relationships with France and Great Britain were at the center of pretty much everything that was happening, including the formation of the first political parties, because the country was so brand new. And it's easy to think, from the 21st century perspective that, of course, it was going to work out because it did. And we've seen the last several hundred years. But that was really not their sense. And they were deeply afraid that the country was going to fail. And they were deeply afraid that it was going to break up into sections and they were going to be consumed by various different European empires. And so this preoccupation with what was going on with France and Great Britain and the correspondence and whether or not people were acting in good faith or whether they were acting as foreign agents, it was kind of a constant, all-consuming affair in the way that I think perhaps is best articulated if we look at the Cold War, when foreign policy and diplomacy, especially with one actor, was such a central part of American culture. I think that that's probably the best comparison I can think of.
And I think that context is important to understanding the Washington presidency and Washington himself. And I think that also says something about why he kind of turned to this cabinet system, because he was scared of failure. And you make that point that his reputation was on the line. If all of this failed, he would be seen as the one who failed the nation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he felt such a tremendous burden to try and see the nation through at least the first couple of years, if not longer, and was acutely aware that every single action he took could lead to failure or would govern who came after him. And so was just really constantly fretting about each action and what it would lead to and what it would leave for the nation when he was gone. And so you're right. I think that's why the cabinet became so important to him is, he, for all of his experience and all of his knowledge, he had only left the country once, and it was when he was a teenager and he went to Barbados. So he didn't have experience at Versailles or the court of St. James, and he needed somebody who understood how diplomatic circles worked. And so that's why the Secretary of State was such an important position, is because it provided that sort of guidance to him and that sort of advice that he needed. And these huge moments, he basically concluded that one person's advice was not sufficient. He needed multiple perspectives. So he understood sort of how to balance between different extremes and different opinions in order to try and find sort of the best middle ground approach.
Absolutely. And conversely, not just in foreign affairs, but also in domestic affairs. And, one of the points that you really emphasize and talk about in good detail is the Whiskey Rebellion. And so I was wanting to see if you could speak to the person who was Attorney General at that time and who was heavily involved, William Bradford, because Bradford, when I was going through the Washington presidency, I started to get interested in him and tried to find more resources, and there just really aren't that many about him. And so whenever I saw that you emphasized him as kind of one of these key players that people don't really know that much about from the cabinet, I wanted to make a point of asking you about him.
Yeah, he is a completely forgotten figure, and partly that's because, unfortunately, he gets sick and he dies during Washington's presidency. But after Thomas Jefferson retired as Secretary of State, then Edmund Randolph was appointed. He basically leapfrogged from Attorney General to the State Department. And so Washington appointed William Bradford for a number of reasons. First and foremost, he had been an officer in the military. He had served with Washington at Valley Forge. He had been at the battles of Trenton and Princeton. So that went a long way in Washington's book because it meant that you had sort of a deep conviction of nationalism and the importance of the military. He also is from Pennsylvania, so it provided good regional diversity to the cabinet, which was always really critical for Washington to have some balance in that way. And he had been an early supporter of the Constitution. He had served in the state government. And so he had the credentials that were really important. But he takes on sort of this additional significance in 1794 with the outbreak of the Whiskey Rebellion, because on one hand, Knox and Hamilton are sort of advocating for immediate military action. And on the other, Randolph is saying, like, if, absolutely, we'll do military action if we have to, but let's try a peaceful solution first. And Bradford comes up with this middle solution, which is send out a peace commission, but not because you expect that it's going to work, because it's important for public opinion to see that you have tried all peaceful options first. And so as to not waste any time, be gathering the militia and getting your military response ready to go, such that when the peace commission fails, you can send out troops. And that really appealed to Washington for a number of reasons. He was very attentive to public opinion, as we've discussed. He didn't want to get out ahead of sentiment against the rebels. But he also liked efficiency. And so he didn't want to have to sit around and wait for the militia to be called up once he determined that he needed them. And then Bradford takes on the sort of additional role in that he goes out to Western Pennsylvania as one of the peace commissioners. And Washington selects a couple of Pennsylvanians, including Pennsylvanians from the Western region, to make sure that they are represented. But he knows that they are all either close personal friends of his, or they are very devoted Federalists and devoted to the national government. So he's not worried about them, throwing him under the bus. But Bradford leads the Peace Commission. He's from Pennsylvania, so he can be sort of a part of this mission. And he writes letters back, basically letting them know the chances of things working out and alerting them to the very high rate of the leaders of this rebellion refusing to cooperate with a peaceful solution. And so that indicates to Washington and the other secretaries that military action is going to be necessary. So he takes on sort of this really oversized role in 1794 that we don't usually think of either the Attorney General or Bradford, because most people don't know who he is.
And it's interesting how some of these figures really do get lost until you start to really examine these periods in the Washington presidency, and they really come to light. And I think one of the points that you make as the cabinet's evolving and cabinet members are leaving and Washington's struggling to find new cabinet members in the second term, you had mentioned in the section on Randolph's resignation, you had written that, quote, Washington acted as though yet another trusted advisor had betrayed or abandoned him. And you really do get the sense whenever you're reading some of Washington's writings at the time and his exasperations at trying to pull together another cabinet, because he was really, the cabinet members had really worked hard on him to put his name forward again in 1792. And then all of a sudden, all of them are gone and he's left kind of holding the bag. And so I was wondering, how much do you feel that Washington's desire to retire might have influenced his decisions or his approach to the cabinet in the second term?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So first, yeah, I think he was very frustrated by the fact that they all insist that he stay in office and then they go and they leave. And the positions were certainly honorable at the time, but they were not particularly well compensated. And it meant that you were away from your family for months at a time. You were away from your businesses. So you probably took an economic hit. And travel was incredibly uncomfortable and took a long time and was expensive. And so it was not a very desirable position. And so he did have a lot of, and it was kind of thankless too, because you were always getting criticized. So he did have a lot of trouble getting people into office. And I sometimes affectionately refer to the replacements as the B team because he just clearly did not want to engage with them in the same way. And
Absolutely. I actually had 2 episodes. The first one was talking about the original cabinet, and I called the episode "The Dream Team," and then talking about the difficulties. That was the not so dream team.
Exactly. And we can see how much he doesn't trust them in 1795 when the Jay Treaty is when he receives the Jay Treaty from London, and he shares it with Randolph, and they keep it a secret for like 3 months, and they don't share it with the other secretaries. And that would have never happened when Hamilton and Jefferson were in office. There's just no way. And so you can see that he super trusts Randolph and he super doesn't trust the other guys. So, I mean, I think partly it was that he trusted his own decision making more. Partly he trusted his ability to sort of process issues. And they had already kind of gone through precedent setting for a lot of the day-to-day activities of governing. He did still convene cabinet meetings when there was a really big moment. So when he decides to use or to assert executive privilege for the first time, Washington convened a cabinet meeting. But I do think probably part of it was at least that he was tired and he wanted to go home, and maybe there was, less of an interest in sitting through cabinet meetings. But also by the last couple of years, especially once Randolph resigns, the cabinet is much more uniform in its partisan ideology. And so he doesn't have the same benefit of hearing Jefferson and Hamilton sort of bicker over issues because they pretty much all agree at this point. And so I think for a lot of reasons, he just felt like it wasn't as helpful or as useful or, whatever reason it was, because he didn't write it down. So we're kind of speculating based on the evidence available. He just didn't really want as much to do with it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I was wondering, because you mentioned that the group of advisors started to be referred to in some of the correspondence as the cabinet around like 1793, 1794. And so I was wondering if that may have played a role, that there was kind of starting to have this linkage to the British cabinet system, and maybe it was seen as being something that wasn't as desirable to be in place. And also around that time, you start to have more of you've got Benjamin Franklin Bosch and in print media, more attacks against Washington and this increase in factionalism. And I was wondering if that may have played a role in his difficulties in finding new cabinet members.
Well, I think it definitely, so the usage of the word cabinet, Madison is using it as early as 1792. And it's, sort of all over the press in 1793. And certainly the heightened partisan tensions contributed to Washington's desire to leave office and perhaps to people's desire to avoid those sorts of offices. I absolutely think that's true. What's really interesting is that Washington refuses to use the word cabinet in his own writing until he retired. And he very clearly knew that that's what other people were calling it, because the second he retired, he referred to John Adams' cabinet as John Adams' cabinet. But he never refers to his own in that way. And so I don't know if that's a desire to try and, stay away from the conflict, to stay away from any sort of British comparison. But certainly that partisan tension 100% contributed to him wanting to leave office. I didn't find any evidence that that's why people turned him down, but my guess is that probably was in the back of their mind.
Absolutely. And especially thinking of it again in that context of the 1790s honor culture, you didn't want to have this bad association, and especially at this time where it wasn't seen as becoming to really seek office.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were not supposed to want to be in office. You were not supposed to campaign for office. You were not supposed to seek it out. Other people were supposed to press you to accept it or sort of, push for your candidacy. So the people who did want to be in the cabinet couldn't really say it, at least not outright. And Washington was trying to select from the sort of cream of the crop if he could, but a lot of those people turned him down. And, for example, he asked John Marshall to be in his cabinet many times, and he said no because Washington was asking him to be the attorney general. And it wasn't until the very end of Adams' administration when he asked Marshall to be the secretary of state. And then, of course, he's appointed to the Supreme Court that he says yes. So it also had something to do with what position you were willing to put people in, because they did have different ranks and different sort of honor that was associated with them.
And I really appreciate how, towards the end, you briefly touched on that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, his immediate successors, kind of by and large kept the cabinet in kind of that Washington context. They followed through with some of that precedent. They didn't really experiment like Washington did with different advisory models. And I was wanting to see if you could speak to that a little bit and why you think that they kind of followed Washington's example.
Yeah, this is such an important point, because if they had done something else, then Washington would have just been sort of remembered as a one-off. But it's the repetition, because the cabinet isn't in the Constitution and isn't written into legislation. It's the repetition through custom that makes it actually an institution over time. And so that their adoption of the cabinet is really essential. Now, Adams is a little bit easier to understand because he had an absolutely impossible task of following Washington. No one was going to be able to do that well, because it's impossible to follow the, most famous man in the world and do a good job. And Adams also presented very differently than Washington did. So I think he was doubly sort of screwed in that way. And so he was trying to provide as much stability and as much continuity as he could, because the country had never experienced a peaceful power transition. And keep in mind, they're primarily used to monarchies, which is the only time you have a transition is when someone dies. And sometimes that transition is accompanied by civil war or murder or intrigue or, anything you can imagine. And so this was a very stressful moment for the country. And so Adams really wanted to provide stability. So he kept the cabinet. He even kept Washington's secretaries, thinking that they would be loyal to him and the office of the presidency, which turned out to be a grave miscalculation because they were actually quite loyal to Hamilton and sought to undermine his reelection campaign and his foreign policy agenda. So that didn't work out so well for him. But he actually set a critical precedent by firing a secretary. He fired Timothy Pickering, which confirmed that the secretaries work for the president and the president has the right to remove them. Then Jefferson is really fascinating because he touts his election as the Revolution of 1800. And yet one of the first things he does in office once his secretaries are in their positions is he writes this letter saying that we're going to follow Washington's model, his first term model for the cabinet. And we'll deal with most of our stuff in individual meetings and correspondence. But then if there are big issues, we'll meet together and discuss in this way. And I actually have an article on Jefferson's cabinet that's going to come out in the Journal of the Early Republic at some point. It's sort of, in line waiting. And Adams and Jefferson are actually going to be the subject of my next book because they present such an interesting comparison of one of the worst cabinets in U.S. history and one of the best cabinets in U.S. history. And so I think that comparison will reveal a lot about how presidents deal with power and ego and ambition at the highest levels of office. And that was certainly something they struggled with. Washington did too, but he was on such a sort of different plane than everyone else that he, I think, had a little bit of an easier time than some of the people that followed him.
Absolutely. And I was actually going to ask kind of where your research was leading you next. And so it's great to hear that you've got plans to take on the Adams and Jefferson cabinets, because that's been one of the interesting things as I've moved into those presidencies to kind of examine some of the differing dynamics. And in the Adams cabinet, you really see an example of a cabinet that doesn't work up until towards the end when he's finally able to replace people. Then it starts working like it should. But then you see Jefferson and just how he's able to really make that cabinet work for him and for his agendas.
Yeah. And I think, obviously there are a lot of really wonderful books out there about Adams, about Jefferson, some great books that compare the two of them. But for some reason, historians have been fairly slow to pick up the cabinet as a lens through which to study presidencies. And I think that it is such an important part of the presidency because they're usually in the smack dab in the middle of all of the action. They can be such an effective tool for outreach and congressional liaison and public policy. But also, I think are a really good measure of presidential leadership because usually secretaries tend to be filled with ego and, they have their own ambitions and they're very experienced in their own expertise and they're used to being listened to. So bringing together a group of people that are not wallflowers and trying to manage them can be a nearly impossible task. And so I'm really excited to continue that research. I started with this book, of course, but continue that research and see what I find as I look at the both of them together.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to read it.
Thanks.
I'll be honest. I wish that your book would have come out a few years before whenever I was working on the Washington presidency, but I'm so glad it's out there now because like you said, they're just really until now, there wasn't a book that examined kind of the cabinet and what it could tell us about the presidency and especially like with Washington, the cabinet played such key roles in various points. Just the fact that it's taken until now to really get a focus on that. Kudos to you for figuring out that there was that gap.
I got very lucky. I mean, and again, there is amazing literature on Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson and their relationships and all that jazz. But I got very lucky. I went looking for a book on the cabinet to understand it better, and I couldn't find one. And then spent the next several years hoping that no one would beat me to it. And once I was done with the dissertation, I was pretty convinced that no other historian would do it because I think that I had pretty much established that was sort of my topic. But I was also kind of concerned that someone who operates in a little bit more of like the journalist realm, like John Meacham, would scoop me. Not that he would like scoop me, but that he would beat me to it. And so I just was crossing my fingers and I was like, oh, please no one get there. And so I was thrilled when I was finally able to get it into readers' hands.
Absolutely. Well, and as we're wrapping up, I just wanted to kind of take us kind of full circle and ask you, because in your acknowledgments, you talked about how you had a goal to, quote, tell the general story. So what would you say are the key takeaways that we can glean about Washington, the individual, by studying him through the context and the lens of the cabinet? And how has this process of telling his story changed your understanding of Washington?
Oh, that's a great question. So the thing that I came away from writing this book about Washington was that I really didn't set out to write a leadership story, but it kind of ended up being one anyway. And Washington was deeply flawed. He could be cruel. He could have quite a temper. He could be malicious and cold, but he also had a deep sense of moral conviction. He had a deep sense of duty and obligation to the nation. He had a constant desire to improve and better himself and an awareness of his own flaws and a willingness to seek help of people that were better than him at things. And so I sort of already felt this way, but through studying him, if anything, I think that I have a better understanding of what he was bad at and where he fell short. And if anything, that increased my sense that he was all the more important to study, because looking at a marble bust and figuring out how we could find someone that's perfect is impossible. And I think leads to a lot of despair if we think about that sort of leadership in the contemporary moment. But if we say, this is a flawed person, and yet he accomplished all of these extraordinary things, what does that tell us about what is actually possible? And I think that is a much more helpful, it's a much more interesting, it's a much more productive use of time. And so I would say that was if anything, I came away more convinced that he needed to be understood and studied in a real and sort of wholesome, and I don't mean wholesome like, happy, but wholesome, like complete way. And that was a really important part of our national story.
I couldn't agree more. And I think in the cabinet, you really did accomplish that.
Oh, thank you so much. That is a wonderful compliment.
So thank you so much for your work, and definitely looking forward to reading your future work. And thank you so much for coming on Presidencies and sharing your research and sharing your insights with the audience.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much again to Lindsay Chervinsky for coming on Presidencies to discuss her research and her new book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. If you'd like to connect with Lindsay on Twitter, she can be found at LM Chervinsky. That's CHERVINSKY, all one word. You can also learn more about her work, media appearances, and upcoming events on her website, www.lindsay.Chervinsky.com. Not only does she share great material about history online, but you might just catch a few photos of her dog, John Quincy Dog Adams. As for this podcast, you can connect with me through social media on Facebook at Presidencies, on Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram at Presidencies Podcast. That's all one word. Past episodes and more information about the podcast, including how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the work here at Presidencies, can be found on the website at presidencies.blueberry, that's BLUBRY.com. Interviews like this and all of the presidential history material provided by Presidencies is supported by listeners like you. And I'd like to do a quick shout out to our newest patrons. Signing up at the Jefferson level of support is Kara, and at the FDR level of support is Michelle. Thanks so much to Michelle and Kara for their commitment to ensuring that this journey through presidential history continues on well into the future. I'd also like to thank all of the listeners who recently left reviews on Podchaser as part of their Reviews for Good fundraiser for Meals on Wheels. Thankfully, they were all positive 5-star reviews, and I thought I'd share a few with you before we wrap up. Pontifex Podcast wrote, quote, excellently researched show and a very charming host. Thank you so much, Pontifex. And likewise, if you haven't listened to Pontifex yet and like podcasts such as Totalis Rankium and Rex Factor, you should check them out as Bree and Fry go through papal history one pope at a time to determine who was the pope beyond compare of all the popes. Alan from the Political History of the United States podcast left the following review. Quote, a fantastic show looking at the history of the presidency. It is well researched and has a fantastic host. Thanks so much. Alan recently did an opening quote for the latest Jefferson episode, and I highly recommend that you check out his podcast as well. He starts with the European Age of Exploration and weaves together a centuries-long tale full of information about how the political schema of what became the United States came into being. Finally, the Tennish podcast left the following review. Quote, a must-listen for anyone interested in American history. Well done. Thanks so much. If you're looking for irreverent and side-splitting humor, then you should check out the Tennish podcast, where the hosts, Nick and Brandon, discuss a different top 10 list each week. Thanks so much to everyone who has left a rating or review on either Podchaser or Apple Podcast. Even in the 21st century, word of mouth is still the best way to share information. So I appreciate all of you who have told folks about Presidencies or shared posts or links to episodes. I couldn't do this without all of you. If you're in the U.S. and are listening to this on the day it's released, I wanted to do a special Mother's Day shout-out to any moms who are listening. Though it's been a decade and a half since I lost my mom, the love that I have for her remains as strong as ever, and her impact can be felt each and every day. Her encouragement of my love of history and my interest in technology led me to this podcast. To all the moms out there, thank you for all that you do. It is not an easy task, and sometimes it may seem thankless. But your time and effort not only has a long-term impact on your child, as this project serves as a testament to, it will impact people that you may not ever meet for decades to come. On that note, and until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
So many people ask me how I felt when George Floyd was killed. And as I sit across a table from a black man who's about to talk about how the murder of another black man felt, I don't think it really matters how I feel.
Hello, I'm Stephen Dorsey, host of Black and White from Evergreen Podcasts. We'll explore and explain how white advantage, bias, and outright discrimination continues to plague our society. Black and White is available wherever you listen to podcasts.